Thanks for tuning in to Keep It Legal, the show where we break down concepts, litigation, and current events with our legal experts. I'm your host, Mark Anik. Joining us today is Andrés Correa with Lynn Pinker, Hurst, and Schwegman in Dallas. Andrés, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Tell me something about your practice. You and I have not had the chance to sit down previously. Tell me what you do.
So we do trial work. We're trial lawyers, or that's what we say. That's what I tell myself I am. We go to court. We handle lawsuits, both sides, plaintiff, defendant. Usually, businesses fighting against each other. So that's really what we do.
When you talk to people who are not in the legal field, do they understand, or do they just think, well, of course, all lawyers are trial lawyers?
You know, that's a good question, because sometimes I say, how do I tell people what I do in a short way, right? If I say I do civil commercial litigation, how many people are really going to know what that means? So I just usually say lawsuits. I just do lawsuits. Somebody gets sued, somebody wants to sue, and usually business lawsuits.
Okay. I always enjoy checking out somebody's bio. And there's a couple of bullets in yours that one of them made me chuckle. And it's settlement of a dispute over a weekend to ensure $40 million credit facility funded on Monday. So I'm picturing you holed up in a room with the door closed and just some Starbucks coming through the door every once in a while.
Yeah, I'm proud of that one, to be honest. That was a junior lawyer, flew to Houston over the weekend. The partner told me, listen, if you want a shot and give this a try to see if you can resolve this dispute, it is for you to decide. So I'm like, sure, I'll go. We did spend all day on a Sunday, cooped up in an office in Houston, had to threaten to walk out several times, had to actually walk out a couple of times. They did the same thing, but after about 8 hours or so, we actually reached the deal, and I'm pretty proud that it all worked out.
Sure. That sounds like one of those the partner says, "You're okay, Skippy. You're a hot shot. Go see if you can resolve this."
I don't know what he really expected out of all of this, but it worked out. So
the other one, secured release from detention for Tibetan asylum seeker. Tell me about that.
Oh man, that was very fulfilling. It's one of the most fulfilling things I've done, honestly, while here. So we do pro bono work on occasion. I myself have done several immigration related, I guess, petitions, asylum petitions, because I'm an immigrant. So I've always felt close to that part of life, and people struggle. And on that one, I think that was one of my first ones. And we had a Tibetan who was seeking asylum, who was in detention in South Texas. Now, you get a lot of Tibetans in New York who are asking for that relief. You don't get as many in South Texas. So they didn't really know what to do with her. To be honest, I didn't know what I was doing very much either. It was one of my first experiences, but I went down there for the first hearing, and I went to the detention center, not to the courthouse, because I wasn't sure where I was going. So from the detention center, surrounded by the detainees, there was a camera where I had to appear in front of the judge, and the judge starts saying, are you the lawyer? And it's like, yes, Your Honor, I'm counsel. I'm sorry I'm not in your courtroom. I thought this is where things happen. So I'm just sitting in the detention center. And then I start talking, because that's what I learned to do as a courtroom lawyer, just talk. And then the judge pauses for a second and says, Mr. Correa, you're not an immigration lawyer, are you? No, Judge.
Judge, is it that obvious?
Was it that obvious? That's right. Thankfully, that was one of several hearings where I learned what I was doing over time, enough to eventually prove her identity. They were worried that she was part of some kind of trafficking ring. They just didn't have a lot of experience with Tibetans coming in through the southern border. But eventually gave him enough comfort where the judge really ordered her released, and she was able to go to New York to meet up with the people that she knew here, and proceed with an asylum application.
That has to be incredibly fulfilling. It
was so real. It was so, the cases we do sometimes, it's fulfilling work on many levels, but not every level. It's a business. It's business disputes, it's contracts. But this one was her personal freedom, her ability to do as she wishes, and her ability to do it in a new place without fear of persecution was very real. And so it was a different experience.
You mentioned that you are an immigrant, and we are a nation of immigrants, and I love immigrant stories. Tell me your immigrant story.
I'd love to tell you how it ends. We're still in the middle of it. I'm curious myself.
I wouldn't like it to end anytime soon.
I'll tell you the beginnings. But I'm from Chile. I immigrated when I was 11 years old. I'm the oldest of four, and my two parents were teachers down there. They taught English. They immigrated with the four of us. I was 11. The youngest was 4, which, having 2 kids of my own now, I find insane to, take 4 young kids and go to something unknown in another country. I think it was my dad's kind of was a niche that he had to scratch in a sense. I think he wasn't. He wanted more. He wanted to see more of the world. He had the opportunity to come to the U.S. in the early '90s as a chaperone for some kids in the private school he taught at to help them figure their way out around Massachusetts and New York, and he liked it. He liked the what he saw, and I remember him thinking back in Chile that he felt that there had to be more than to what we had, than at the moment. And so he was, I think, always looking for an opportunity. He and my mom applied for a program that was looking for Spanish teachers for public schools in Louisiana, and that's how they got a visa to come over with us when I was 11. So they ended up teaching Spanish in public schools in New Orleans right when we landed, and for those first 2 years. Now the experience was hard. It was difficult. 2 years in New Orleans, I was just coming into my own. I think as new teenager, young adult, and so to come to a completely different culture in an environment that was very different. And New Orleans, in particular, can be a tough place. It can be a compelling place, but also a very tough place. So we were in a very poor neighborhood of New Orleans. There was a lot of violence. I remember losing friends, to gunshots. I remember watching, stabbings, lots of violence where we lived. There was a lot of racism in the apartment complex where we lived. They would not open the doors to Black people at all. We were actually told when we would see Black people waiting to come in to check out this very small apartment complex in the middle of a very Black area, being told we don't answer the door for those people. So it was kind of a crash course in the complexities of America, right? The America I knew was from movies. It was of grandeur and, wide streets and clean neighborhoods and everything. And we landed in a very difficult, complex, part of the country.
How did that affect your view? The traditional, if you and I were in Hollywood, your story would begin with problems under Pinochet, and then you get here and the streets would be paved with gold. Reality is not that, as you've just explained. So how did that affect you as an 11-year-old and then a young teen?
I was angry. I think there was a lot of anger for years, frankly. And as I think back upon it, almost a certain defensiveness. It's like it's a way to defend the anxiety and the difficulty of being in such a new and challenging place, was to kind of strike back and counterattack and criticize and say America, the imperialists that interfered with the democratic processes of Chile back in the 70s and helped put a dictator in place, or America, the racial oppressor that has not really given justice to its minority populations, African Americans, Hispanics. So I think I spent a long time where that was my vision of America. It was a negative one. One that I kind of rebelled against. And so even my readings, everything, like my favorite book was the autobiography of Malcolm X. My favorite historical figure was Che Guevara, the Cuban revolutionary, or Argentinian Cuban revolutionary. And I probably spent years there through my adolescence and into college, kind of rebelling against that. And even notions where I would be told, oh, this is the land of freedom. And I'm like, well, might have been born in a dictatorship, but that ended in '89. And I remember being a child and doing whatever I wanted in Chile. What's so different? What is this freedom? What are you talking about? I guess what is so special? And the experience being the first 2 years in New Orleans, as I mentioned, tough experience. And my parents started looking for opportunities elsewhere. We wound up in Dallas because my mother had a teaching job at the Hockaday School in Dallas, wonderful school. And I'm always very thankful for her because it was them as professionals, good professionals, able to get these opportunities, and moved us to Dallas. Dallas was it looked more like the movies, right? The North Dallas that I saw. This is kind of America, but it was tough in its own special way. It never really felt welcoming.
At what point did the rebellious streak in you change that you were able to see, and I'm assuming the value of America as well, the upside as well as the down?
I've thought a lot about that. I think a couple of things happened. So first, throughout high school into college, as I developed more relationships with friends, teachers, friends' parents too, I started realizing the generosity of some of the people we came across and how they helped me and how they helped us. People who helped our family in times of need, people who just wanted to lend a helping hand, even for tiny things, oh, your AC is out. Why don't you come here, stay with us, or let me help you fix it? Or, oh, there's a storm coming. We have a cellar. Here's what you do in this kind of storm, because we never had experience with that kind of storm. We know earthquakes in Chile, but not thunderstorms. Or more fundamentally, like, oh, you're going off to law school. Let me gift you $1,000 so you can buy a computer to take with you. Let me gift you a suit so you can have a suit to wear, because I've never had one.
Wow.
Going off to law school. Little things and bigger things too. The biggest of all is my scholarship. I was able to study at UT Dallas because of the $32 million donation of Margaret McDermott. She being the wife of one of the 3 founders of TI, and realizing I am studying my entire college education is because somebody from this country, believing in its ideals, decided to further those ideals by making it possible for me and others to study for free. And so that generosity, combined with the opportunity to do really interesting things, I think is what started turning all of this around. For me, internally anyway. In college, through that same scholarship program, I got to intern at the United Nations in DC, got to spend time in DC through a summer program, got to travel all around Latin America. Thanks to the McDermott Scholarship, got to be exposed to operas and symphonies, a really rich experience outside the classroom, not just in the classroom. And I think what happened is, how can I be so angry at the people who are helping me? It's not that simple, right? It's not just, America isn't just one thing or another thing. It is multiple things and thousands and millions of people, each of them different, but which at least share a belief in American dream, in American opportunity. And that, I think, is where I realized maybe that's what freedom means. It's the freedom to like choose your life and have opportunity to do that in a way, the opportunity that frankly is not as available in Chile, where there seems to be a ceiling for a lot of things. Here in Dallas, Texas specifically, I've yet to find a ceiling. I think it's if you want to accomplish it and you think you can do it, then have at it.
You mentioned the McDermott Scholarship, and part of your educational effort was tied to House Bill 1403 in 2001. Tell us about that and what it did for people who were immigrant kids.
Right. So I was a high school student at the time, and we thought we were not going to be able to stay here, couldn't afford college because I was on a visa. I couldn't have access to most forms of financial aid, definitely not state financial aid. And so I happened to be in Austin for a completely unrelated reason, just visiting the capital, where somebody tells my parents, who then tell me, it's like, hey, they're debating a bill that could allow you to pay 1/3 of the tuition price so you could actually afford it, and might also give you access to some financial aid. And I typed up a 1-pager talking about, here's who I am. I've been to school. I got good grades. I've done what you tell me I'm supposed to do. And yet I still have a hard time getting to college, but you can help with House Bill 1403. Started lobbying. I didn't know what lobbying meant until I learned it at age 17. Started going from office to office, handing out this little flyer. Had a photo opportunity with Governor Rick Perry, of all people, at the time. Who, maybe today you'd never imagine he would have been kind and welcoming to immigrants, but he was. And so was the Texas legislature, which was very conservative at the time and has been for a long time. He said, I think he said something like, I was a high school student. He's just talking to me. He's like, okay, if we get this fixed, will you stay in Texas? I'm like, sure, of course. I'll stay in Texas. I just want to go to college. And it passed not because of anything I did. It passed with a lot of support. I think there's a couple of holdouts, but by and large, it was at a time in Texas where I think Texas understood that if you allow people to educate themselves, they will contribute and become
to
valuable
society.
Members of your community.
And just so we're clear, 1403 allowed people who, and correct me please if I'm getting this incorrect, but it allowed people like you who had immigrant status to go to school in Texas and pay
In-state
state
tuition.
school in-state tuition rates.
That's right.
Which made it possible in your household.
Yes. I mean, it was a difference between paying $5,000 for a semester or 15. It was a large difference in the cost. And it did two things, right? I was not undocumented. I was on a visa, but it made no distinction on that basis. It just said, look, if you've gone to school in Texas for at least 3 years and you graduate, you got your diploma, we'll let you go to school and pay in-state tuition.
That was game changing.
It was. I think, I always remember, I think it was either the first or one of the first in the country to do that. It happened later with a handful of other states. And that's what ultimately DACA was supposed to be. The DREAM Act at a federal level. That's what it's called at the federal. It's the same deal, just at the federal level, the DREAM Act. It hasn't passed for many, many years. And that's why President Obama came up with DACA as a workaround to that. DACA was never supposed to be a permanent solution. It was just a Band-Aid on what hopefully someday will be the DREAM Act.
Speaking of which, that case just went again from a federal appellate court from the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans back to the district court in Houston. One of 3 cases that are going on.
I think so.
If you had to look into your crystal ball, since you're the one with the law degree, and prognosticate based on your vast knowledge, do you have any sense of where we're going with DACA?
I mean, if it makes its way back to the Supreme Court, I think most people would guess it's not going to go the way of DACA, right? That the court would prefer, this particular court would rule that the executive branch couldn't do what it did and that Congress should be the one to do it. So that would be my guess if it goes back up that far. That doesn't mean it will, because it's not easy for a court to hear every case. I mean, there's got to be enough interest among the justices to hear a case. But I think if it does, it's more likely that they would get rid of DACA and force, not really force, just say it's up to Congress. And then Congress,
right?
We all know what that's like.
You mentioned, I want to go back to 1403. You mentioned it's 2001. Rick Perry is the governor you're working with. It is a conservative Texas legislature, but it passed. And I looked it up. I believe you're correct. It was the first in the nation. 21 years later, if that legislation went to that legislature today, would it pass?
No, absolutely not. I don't think so. It's been made, immigration's become one of the ways I think that politicians today inflame people and try to elicit emotional responses by honestly, frankly, mischaracterizing what's happening and what's going on. Just like with this country, that there's good and bad, with immigrants coming into the country, there's all kinds of folks as well. And to be honest with you, the vast majority are hardworking people just looking for a good life, a better life, and wanting to contribute in their jobs, in their churches, in their communities, and their neighbors. But today, I feel like there's just no acknowledgement of that, particularly on the Republican side. And I want to say this because the one of the co-authors of the bill, of House Bill 1403, was Fred Hill. Fred Hill at the time was a Richardson representative. I think he was ranked from least conservative to most conservative, least conservative being number 1, most conservative being 150. He was 147. So wow. This is an individual who was well known and respected as a highly conservative individual. And he was a co-author of House Bill 1403 of the DREAM Act back in the day. I talked to him about why he did it, and he told me he grew up working alongside Mexican migrants in the fields. And he recognized they're good people and willing to work hard. And so he saw no problem with having that be part of our community. Unfortunately, that's not the environment we have today, I don't think.
Some things have changed and perhaps not for the best.
Agreed. To that point, though, things change, sometimes for the worse, but eventually, I think on a long enough timeline, I think we'll see it come back around.
You're an optimist.
I have to be. I want to be, yeah. It's better to live life that way.
You mentioned in a D Magazine article from a couple of years ago, actually from last year, my wife and I joke about the immigrant mindset. You show up to work, are thankful for the job you have, keep pushing forward and do the best you can. And it occurs to me, that's a good mindset for just about anybody, right?
Yeah, I got to credit her with putting it, with kind of coming up with that concept. And she's right. There's what started out as anger at this point is gratitude, to be honest with you, to just have had the chance to do something so new and different And to be successful, right? To be able to go to law school, to be able to work at a good firm, to be able to represent clients that are important, sophisticated, and intelligent, um, to be able to be in courtrooms and make arguments about important issues, to be able to affect the law. The gratitude, like, how am I so lucky to have all this, right? And so I think that informs to me what a lot of, if an immigrant's coming here, more often than not, it's because they are not satisfied with wherever they are. So they want something more and different. And that means if they're willing to travel half the world for that, then they want it pretty bad. And they're willing to work for it and make an effort for it. And I think that's what that comment gets at. That if you're here, it means, and you came from somewhere else, it means you're ready to work and fight for what you want. And so take what you receive, be grateful for it, but keep plowing ahead, and see what else you can do.
You mentioned being in the courtroom, and I want to go to a piece that you wrote a couple of years ago where you said you talked about being in the courtroom and being in front of a largely Hispanic jury. This was you were representing T. Boone Pickens, and you wrote about the persistent biases against educated professional members of a minority group when applying for a job or submitting their work for evaluation. I have been told to go back to my country and that I've only succeeded thanks to affirmative action. Those things actually happen?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you do when those things happen? In light of all the good, in light of somebody buying you a suit, in light of somebody providing you a laptop, does it stun you when this sort of racial bias is something that you come face to face with?
I guess a little bit. Maybe every time it stuns you just what people will do and say in general. But one of the comments you remember that you just mentioned, go back to your country, was anonymous. In fact, the most hateful things I've received has been anonymous, which to me tells me there's a lot of cowardice there.
An awful lot of cowardice.
Yes. And so that, just to begin with, like, why am I going to pay attention to this or you? If you're not even, strong enough, confident enough to tell me this. I received a letter, an anonymous letter, while working here as well. I remember I guess about a year ago during the pandemic, with hateful things as well. But the cowardice to me says you're not worth it. I think to me it's helpful, though. It reminds me that mindset exists. It's not a majority. It's not that extreme, but it's also not completely non-existent or just crazy people. No, there are lots. We all have biases, all of us.
Sure.
And so I think those comments remind me that those biases exist, and we need to be aware and conscious of them and not just bury our heads in the sand and pretend that that's all over and that we've moved on from all of that.
Right. You learned starting at age 11 and then going through high school and college and the evolution of your own thought processes that there's an awful lot of nuance in this country.
Yes.
And I see something like that, and I think, unfortunately, we have to learn that there's nuance. Again, there's good and there's bad, and there's a little bit of everything in between.
And that's okay. Like that's where I've landed.
That's
okay.
humanity.
It is. And it's actually, it's sometimes we look back at times of turbulence and want to say, oh, we went through that and it's over and it was so easy. And if I could go back, of course I would march with Dr. King. And of course I would fight on behalf of, freedom. It's easy to say that from the comfort of your chair, 50 years after the fact.
Right.
But these struggles are ongoing and it's never super clear cut. Right. And I remember reading at some point that, Dr. King had about the support of maybe 30% or less of the American population back in the day, according to surveys. I mean, today it's like, who wouldn't? But it's never that clear cut. But what that means is we have a choice. We each can get to choose. Are we going to be in the side of justice and fairness and have the confidence to not be afraid to speak about these issues openly? Or are we going to just sit back and be the silent majority that allows a lot of atrocities to happen or bad things to happen? And I think at every turn in history, including now, you have to fight for the good things. You have to, it doesn't just disappear, go away because we did it in the past and now we've moved on and we're all better people. In part we are. In part we're better and more just, I think, but the work isn't done.
You and I are sitting here in your office having this discussion in the midst of Hispanic Heritage Month, which is the reason for our sitting down, and I'm glad we took advantage of it. Is that the thought, if there's one thought that you want people to take away from any of these months that we set aside for a minority group, is that the thought that, hey, this, there's good here, but you have to fight for it every day and every week and every year?
I think that it's we seem to get into so many arguments about, you hear it, America is good, don't criticize it because it's great, or America is terrible because it's so racist. It is all of those things all at once. It is neither just the good or just the bad. And so yeah, I and even thinking about my own journey, all the things I was angry about over time, there was truth to it, right? There was truth. The US has had its share of involvements with other countries and has had sometimes bad, sometimes good effects in other countries. And it's done good things and also bad things internally to Americans themselves. Um, but acknowledging all of that, the bad on the one hand, respecting and celebrating the good, I think you can do both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It's not a binary choice. You can truly do both. Just like with my anger, I acknowledge that yes, there are things that made me angry. There are things that made me sad about what happened. But there's also a lot of good in my life and a good that I've received from the country as well, whether it's through work or education or family and friends. All of that can coexist, and we each get to choose whether we're trying to focus and build upon the good while acknowledging the bad or nothing, right? Or what else are you going to
You are the hiring partner here at the firm. And part of that is an effort with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm assuming. What does that mean for you from a practical standpoint as you look at candidates who could be a colleague someday? What are you looking for, and how does that impact the discussion nowadays in the 21st century?
I think I've this firm's culture has always been, look, I don't care who you are. If you get an idea, bring it to the table. It doesn't matter if you work in the mailroom or if your name's on the door. We look for good ideas. We look for people that want to make a contribution, want to be part of the team. And if you have that kind of team, it is essential that you have different kinds of people contributing to it. Essential. And I think lots of researchers back this up along the way, to say that diverse teams are actually more productive and achieve more in business in general. Number one. Number two, it's also the right thing to do. Meaning, let's make sure everybody has an opportunity. Let's every now and then look around us and see, do we look like the rest of the country does? Because if not, why not? Right? What's missing, if anything? And so I think informed by that, what I look for is diversity of experience. And in particular, and this is thanks to some of my colleagues here at the firm, people who have had to struggle with something and come through and survive it. People who have overcome things, because this job can be hard. You win, you lose. You could lose tons of money, or you could lose somebody's business who's relying on you to fight for it. So you have to be ready to deal with failure. So I look for that, and sometimes, no, not sometimes, always that comes in diverse forms, right? What people have had to get through. Sometimes it's an immigration experience. Sometimes it's not. It is simply something they went through as a family, or something that happened to them in school some time ago, or maybe in something in sports or an injury. So I try to see what experience. I try to look for experiences that show that somebody will have grit and be relentless and get through things. And in diversity specifically, yes, I look for minority candidates, but the way I do it is I ask. We work with recruiters, and I say, look, one of our priorities is to hire diverse folks, and they exist. A lot of people in the legal world say, there's not enough candidates. There's plenty of candidates. Okay, you can find them. You just have to be willing to spend the time and demand that that's what you want and that's what you want to see. But that's just the first part. Having a diverse slate of candidates come in through the door is just the first part. In fact, I would argue 99% of the work is after that.
How so?
Make sure that your culture is one that's welcoming. And I remember my own experience coming into Dallas and not feeling particularly welcome, and that it allows for everybody's development and growth in an environment that I remember. I mean, I didn't think I belonged here. You're coming to a meeting, everybody in their suit and tie, they all speak a certain language, a certain financial language, certain nuances and customs that I'm not familiar with, that I've never lived through. And so somebody has to be willing to help you kind of bridge that cultural gap from whatever world you may be coming from, in the business world, where the norms are certain things, where the expectations are certain, the way you communicate is a certain way, things that are helpful. And so an example I've used before is, imagine you are put somewhere in the middle of a Brazilian company today, go work.
Right.
You have no idea
Fish out
what
of
they
water.
expect. You have no idea how things work. You just don't know. And it's not because there's a problem with you or with them. You're just different. And I think that's what happens if you are successful in bringing, and I don't just mean racial diversity, I mean ideological diversity, ethnicity, religion, I mean diversity across the spectrum, true
Right.
diversity, different kinds of people. Then you do have to spend the time to make sure we can all find common ground and come together and learn about each other too.
How do you do that and do it effectively? Because I've heard from people who've said exactly that, for instance, she was African American, she was brought in the door. Okay. Now what?
Right.
Right?
So I don't think I have the answer to this, but I'll tell you what I've kind of where I lean. I think the first thing is you just have to spend time with people. Something as simple as being a good human. Just like, let me dedicate some of my time, which is busy time, demanding time. You got work, family, everything. Let me spend some of that time with you on a regular basis. Let's talk. How are you doing? What's going on? What are your questions? What are your anxieties? I mean, that's, in a sense, that's, if you care about somebody growing within your organization, you need to do that. It's not enough to just say, okay, here's your desk, here's your computer, do a good job, I'll see you later. It's just not enough. You might want to think it is, you might want to desire, but no, you have to spend some time. And I think when it comes to people that are very similar to you, so if a Chilean walked into my office today, yes, I'd spend a lot of time with that person because we probably have some good things in common. But when it's somebody different, a different race, a different nationality, then you really have to make an effort because you're less likely to just do it naturally. You have to reach out to spend time. So I would say that's number one. Just spend the time with people. Number two, I think it's helpful to have just training and kind of more formal, and I'll be honest with you, we work on this at the firm a lot. We're not quite there yet, but more training and formal ways of passing on knowledge about here's how you do things. Not just the hard skills, but the soft skills as well. The hard skills, sure, you need to know how to prepare a lawsuit. You need to know how to go to court. You need to know the rules. That's one thing. But the soft skills of how do you get work here? How do you respond when a client or a partner at the business tells you they need something? How do you deliver your work product to that person? What are their particular needs or interests? Or how are you a good professional in this environment? I think you can't assume everybody just figures that out. I don't think that's good. I think you need to actually take some time to teach people what's expected of them in any particular.
And you're teaching them the firm culture. I like your rule at the top of that discussion, be a good human.
Yeah.
It's a good guidepost, I think, for all of us. Andres, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you again for joining us today. That was Andrés Correa with Lynn Pinkerhurst and Schwegman in Dallas. You can visit Lynn, LYNNLLP.com for more information about the firm. Make sure to like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, and tune in next time to Keep It Legal. I'm your host, Mark Anik. See you next time.